All right, part 4, War on Terrorism. So in 1993, an unknown, by most people anyway, somewhat rich Saudi man decided to bomb the World Trade Center in New York City. He put a bomb in the basement parking garage, but the bomb was not made right, or something happened, and it went off, but it only caused minimal damage instead of the massive damage he was hoping for, which would have brought the building down, one of the two twin towers. That man's name was Osama bin Laden, as many of you know. He was not in the country, and he was not captured. He was on the run, on the loose, at the top of the terror watch list. Clinton administration couldn't find him, assuming they were looking that hard. Because the ones who did find him was a country you wouldn't even suspect. And the only reason this country even captured him was probably to get something for it. They themselves didn't need him, didn't want him, didn't care one way or the other. That country was the Sudan, or Sudan. There is no the Sudan. The country was Sudan. In Africa. They caught him. In the late 90s, maybe some 3 or 4 years after he had perpetrated the deed, the Sudanese government called the President of the United States, Bill Clinton. And they said, "We have Osama bin Laden. You want him?" Now, most of you do not know about this, probably, or had forgotten. The Sudanese government offered Osama bin Laden to the United States on a silver platter. And what was President Clinton's response? This man who loathed the military, this man who thought flyover, no-fly zones was a way to control a known violent dictator slash terrorist sponsor slash genocidal maniac. He said, "I wouldn't know what to do with him. No thanks." And he didn't take him, obviously. He was handed him. I don't know what the cost would have been, if any. But he didn't know what to do with him, so he didn't take him. What do you need to do with him? Throw him into a freaking cell, put him on trial, whatever. What do you need to know how to deal with him? And this is not me just making shit up. This is actually a recording of the response that Bill Clinton made to the press in response to the offer the Sudanese government made. He said in this recording, an actuarial, "I didn't know what to do with him, so I did not take him." This is before 9/11, of course. He admitted it. He had him, could have had him, and for some asinine reason that makes no sense at all, he let him go. The Sudanese didn't need him. Maybe he escaped. I don't know what happened. He got away. Or he was let go. On to plot his next great feat. This time he had more money. He had a better plan. He worked with other groups. Now he was working with a group called Al-Qaeda that came out of the Taliban from Afghanistan, and funded by multiple sponsors of terrorism. One of which, by the way, was Iraq. Saddam Hussein had two major things going for him after the Persian Gulf War. He could build up his army and hide the weapons of mass destruction he thought he might need. And also, he could spend money, while he couldn't be a terrorist himself, he could spend money sponsoring terrorism, which he did before the Gulf War. He actually had training camps in his country that allowed other groups to come in and train using Iraqi's technology, which was partly American. Something they could not do where they came from. A more modern mechanized and a modern version of weapons and training that they could have and afford in Iraq that they could not do in the poor location, perhaps, of wherever they were coming from. He sponsored that. And when he couldn't do that in his house, in his own country, I mean, because of no-fly zones, whatever, he sponsored it with money. Money he didn't give to his people, but kept way at the top, as we learned later. So, he was a sponsor of terrorism. Before 9/11. Keep that in mind as we move forward here. Saddam Hussein was a sponsor, a trainer of terrorists, a sponsor of terrorism, and a man who held weapons of mass destruction, still known by everybody, recorded, reported in writing by the UN and the Clinton administration prior to 9/11. Then we have Florida 2000. A close race in a presidential election. Perhaps the closest we've ever had. And it all comes down to one state. That the Democrats were desperate to continue the legacy and the policies of Bill Clinton. They couldn't stand the fact that their great messiah, Bill Clinton, who they excused of every scandal, of every malfeasance, of every disgusting act he did while president in order to move their agenda forward, now wanted his protege, Al Gore, to take over and continue this legacy. And they would stop at nothing to make it happen. And in Florida, they tried desperately to make that state swing blue. And they did three major things to try to make that happen. The first thing they did was they tried to deny the military men and women who lived in Florida and elsewhere, but specifically in Florida, from having their vote count. Because somebody on a ship at sea, for instance, forgot to sign some of the paperwork before submitting it to the Secretary of State of Florida for count. Now, they do those counts separately from the election, or counted ahead of time, I believe, but they try to decertify all of those votes. Now, why? Because they knew that the military tends to be 70+% Republican and not Democrat. So, by decertifying all those votes, thousands of Republicans have their vote nullified. That was the first thing they tried to do. The second thing they tried to do was done by the mainstream media, as we all know, are provable and laughable guardians of anything left-wing today. They carry the water, they'll actually pour the water and make the water, and they're like Democrats in Congress themselves, in government themselves. In this case, they pulled a little tricky fast one, and that is many of the news outlets during the election decided to call the race in Florida early. Now, Florida has 2 time zones. The peninsula is Eastern time zone, but the Panhandle is the Central time zone. And there's a lot of Republicans that live in the Panhandle. A lot. Thousands and thousands and thousands. Tens of thousands. Maybe hundreds of thousands. Pensacola, all up in there. And the media knew this. They calling it early for, I think for Al Gore, I'm not sure, made a lot of people who had an extra hour to go vote turn around in their cars and go home. It's already called, there's no point for me to vote. And thousands of Republican voters went home and did not vote in the Florida elections in the Panhandle because of the media. Now you take the military vote and you take the thousands from the Panhandle, and this was no longer going to be this close count that they had after the election. This was going to be clearly a Republican victory. But they didn't have some of the military. Eventually, maybe they did. I don't know if that ever got allowed. But they definitely didn't have the Panhandle. So, George Bush Jr., H.W. Bush, or George W. Bush, 43, had to suffer through a recount, or 30. What, of course, a lot of people don't tell you is that every single recount following that election, following the time when the Secretary of State of Florida decided that through their means they found that the election was won by Bush. Every single recount had Bush winning. Every one. All 30 or so of them. No matter who sponsored it, Democrat or otherwise. Bush won that election. He won Florida and he won that election. Fair and square. Period. But the Democrats were pissed. They sent lawyers down there to try to undermine election. They tried to make this into something it wasn't. They tried to change the rules in the middle of the game. They tried to upset Americans and screw up with their feelings and make people guess and second guess and question and all this other stuff just to muddy the waters. Sound familiar? And so, to pay them back for losing that election, they had something up their sleeve. What would it be? Well, they probably didn't know at the time. But once the opportunity presented itself, boom. Now they were going to pounce. Throughout the late 90s, all the way up to 2003, 2 years after 9/11, Democrats, along with Republicans, including people from the Clinton administration that came prior, repeatedly said Saddam Hussein in Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Not could have, not might have, had them. That he was a danger to the world and to his own people. That he was a genocidal maniac who needed to be watched and dealt with, and eventually would have to be dealt with. In my book, I have a blog, not my book, but I have a blog that I wrote this. There is no less than 24 times, and that was just a grouping of them from prominent Democrats and others. Clinton, Al Gore, John Kerry, Richard Gephardt, Henry Waxman, it goes on. Nancy Pelosi goes on and on and on about how dangerous Saddam Hussein was. Some of it was said before Bush became president, by the way. Some of it right after 9/11. But it was all consistent. So, when Bush asked Congress to expand the war out of Afghanistan and against the Taliban and Al Qaeda to go into Iraq because Iraq was a sponsor of terrorism and a known war criminal, crimes against humanity, and a person who was never totally dealt with. Now that we're fighting a war on terrorism, not just a war on Al Qaeda, not just a war in Afghanistan, but now we're fighting a war on terrorism wherever terrorism is. And that was the doctrine. That was the doctrine that Bush came up with. Bush did not say, we're just going after the people who knocked down these buildings at 9/11. Bush said he was going to go after anybody who sponsored terrorism, anybody who perpetrated terrorism, anybody who harbored terrorism or performed terrorist acts. All of them. And that's an important distinction. In our next segment and final segment, we'll talk about how the Democrats betrayed the United States and where we are in the war on terrorism today. See you then.